So with that, I'd like to welcome you all to this session of LLF. We'll be starting off with our session, A World Beyond Superheroes. Right next to me, I have my fellow panelists, starting off with Fatimah Asghar, a renowned writer and poet who wrote and co-produced a few episodes of the hit Disney Plus show Miss Marvel. And right next to her is Jahanzeb Aslam, former teacher of the impact of graphic novels at PNU and our resident expert on all things super. Joining us soon will be Mudassar Butt, a veteran writer who's been writing comic books in Pakistan for over a decade and currently teaches comic book writing and illustration right here in Lahore. Now, I'm Faris Ahmed, and I'll be moderating this session today. And I think with that, we can directly start off with some of the questions I have. Now, this question is directed towards Fatima. As someone who's recently worked in Hollywood on a superhero property, what do you perceive of the cultural impact of the genre? And why do you think there's been so much decline over the past few decades?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us. And thank you to Faris for moderating. And I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. I worked on Miss Marvel, and in terms of the cultural impact of what it was, when we were working on the TV show, we knew that this would be one of the first Pakistani family TV shows that existed in the West. So we knew that it was going to be a very, very big deal and that there was going to be a lot of eyes on this TV show in a way that I don't think that our community in the West had seen before. And so we knew that we had a very unique opportunity because we had an opportunity to where the audience for this was going to be a Western audience, a South Asian audience, an audience of all different backgrounds, Muslim audiences of all different backgrounds who were just fans of Marvel and who were consuming things with Marvel, which is really different than, that audience is a very different audience than, say, the audience for my poetry or the audience for my novels or the audience even for TV shows that exist kind of in a more siloed branch. Because this was in a franchise and because it was a really big Marvel-based franchise, we knew that there was going to be a lot more eyes on it. And so it gave us a really unique opportunity to reach a very vast audience that we wanted. And then in terms of at least my experience both as an artist, but also as an audience member for things like Marvel and for things like superhero stories, what I felt was that actually there was a way where there's a difference between graphic novels and comics and superheroes, which are such a beautiful art in its own. And then also there was a difference between something like film and TV, which can again just reach a more mass audience. So an example of that is something like Black Panther, which was a, comic book in the MCU that a lot of people who are comic book people knew about. But then when it went to film, it reached an entirely new audience base. So a lot of people who were superhero fans but only watched film and didn't watch the comics got to be introduced to this character in a really new and invigorating and exciting way. In a very similar way, we knew that was going to happen for Miss Marvel. And we had only had 5 years of publishing before we made the TV show, so we knew that there was going to be a lot of eyes on this character and people who maybe didn't know who she was prior to our TV show coming out. And so we just knew that there was going to be a lot of people who were going to see this. And then in terms of the change, something I've experienced is from the film side, there's actually been such a more renewed interest in the films around Marvel in the last 10 years because of the way that Marvel has kind of changed, rebranded, and packaged their films in a very different way. And because now you have things like the Avengers and all of these intersecting plot lines, there's a way that a lot of people are being exposed to these characters in a way that they weren't previously. So actually, in my experience at least, in the last 10 years, there's been a bigger kind of push for the films and the TVs. There's been more properties around superheroes. There's been more innovative things that have been happening on a film and TV side that have existed previously.
And in that sense, do you think you succeeded in what you wanted to achieve with Miss Marvel in bringing it to a wider audience and making it a much more accessible comic book as compared to its comic book counterpart?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for us, we also knew that this was an introduction. So we knew that this was going to be the first time that all of these people met and witnessed Kamala Khan, and that she was also going to go into the films, that she was going to go have more things beyond just this TV thing, but this was her origin story. And so I don't know if has anybody read the comics for Miss Marvel as well as seen the TV show? Can I just get a show of hands if anyone has read the comics before? So there's like two, there's like two people who read the comics. And so in the comics, her origin is actually quite different than her origin in the TV show. I think that was like a big thing that we did differently. We baked her origin into partition, and we baked her origin into history in a way that didn't exist in the comics. And we also really changed certain things about her powers and her power set. And so the origin story is entirely different from what we did than what was in the comics. And so even that, we were able to kind of do so much more by kind of situating this in culture, by situating it in history, by giving her more of a backstory, by giving her family more of a backstory. And so in doing that, we were kind of able to really kind of, I think, sink deeper into a historical, a cultural context in the TV show. And so for us, that was a really, really big component. We didn't want her to feel random, or we didn't just want her to feel as a part of something. We wanted that to be a very culturally specific thing. And so I think we were really able to succeed in doing that in the TV show.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Even now in the comic books, in the most recent Miss Marvel issues, they've reworked her entire origins, made her part of the X-Men, and have started changing her power set, which is directly influenced from the show itself. So I think in that sense, you really did succeed. Now, another thing you've also brought up is the differences between films and TVs, graphic novels, comic books. Could you maybe elaborate a little more on the subtle differences between expression in all the mediums?
Yeah, so I feel like you would also have some really good insight onto this, but I think that for film, so I started off as a poet. That's what I am by trade, and when I started writing poetry, the statistic that everybody kept giving me was that less than 1% of the population of the world reads poetry. So I was like, oh, okay, like not that many people read this, and so I was writing poetry, and then I started to write for TV. And instantly everything shifted, just on the amount of people who are watching it, even a web series, even short form content, the amount of people who could watch that and consume that in a different way was mind-boggling to me. And I don't know what the statistics are in comics and graphic novels, but there is a difference in terms of the readership of something that's in print and somebody reading something like that versus being able to watch something, because a lot of people are passive consumers for watching things. Like when you think about entertainment, like you might be in a mall and they're playing something. You might be in a dentist shop and they're watching TV. You might be in an airport and they're screening something. And you kind of have a way where you're passively always consuming film and media. And so that kind of medium just has a lot more of a grab because of the visual stimulation of it. And something like Marvel, something like Disney, they're huge conglomerates that have such a big push in shaping the world. And when you think about the MCU, particularly the MCU, not in the comics, because I know that that's a whole different history. The MCU became famous with Iron Man. And Iron Man, they were depicting all of these Muslim people as terrorists. That it was such a flat depiction of what Muslimness was, what people from our part of the world inhabited, and that was what made them famous. So 20 years later, to have a TV show like Miss Marvel is such a huge difference from the kind of base that this company first started creating, their stories on. And they can only do that by including storytellers like us, including, a shifting landscape. And that could only have happened because when Miss Marvel, the comic, came out, it was such a big deal. When that comic came out, that first comic, you could correct me, I think it was one of the most highly selling comics that came out when it first did, and it kind of reinvigorated in some ways this kind of franchise on a comic level. And I think there's a lot of characters who've done that. That was like Miles Morales and Spider-Man as well. It was all of these comics of color that were coming out where people of color were being like, hey, these are our stories, and then people finding a lot of relevance in that. And so there's differences in the genre, and then there's also these similarities in terms of representation that we see happening in the genre.
Now, Jazib, I have the same question for you as well. Like, what do you think of the differences between the different mediums like graphic novels, comic books, and TV shows and movies?
I mean, the differences have slightly declined thanks to CGI because the CGI has massively improved what we can see before us. I remember even up until 10 years ago, CGI was so limited that you could still see the wires, you could still see the wire work that was happening just to make someone fly. It was still something that you enjoyed. You could suspend disbelief and be like, yes, I can believe that this person is flying, this person is doing all these fantastic superheroic things. But the particular energy that comics had back then just could not be replicated on screen. It's still true to a very great extent. There is some stuff that can be done in comics, especially with facial expressions and with overall direction, that you still can't really replicate as far as film or TV is concerned. But the gap has shrunk, and I would imagine the gap will continue to shrink because as technology develops, and it is developing, it will continue to slowly shrink exactly what we see on panel versus what we see on screen. And Miss Marvel specifically, as you mentioned, it was a massive seller in the comics when it first came out. It went back for printings at least 12 times, which is unheard of in the comic space. And it was also a social media darling, which was also something that the comic industry sorely needed at the time. Because there was a lot of backlash, especially when it comes to misogyny in comics, which has been a long-lasting problem. And as far as Islamophobia is concerned, because this came out shortly after 2001. And everyone was still remembering September 11th very specifically. And it was the creators felt that there was a great need, especially the writer G. Willow Wilson. She did a fantastic job with this, where there was a need to present an alternate view of Muslims. We needed to show that they're not all a monolith that is just this terrorist that the US had come to see all Muslims as. So this comic played a very key role in shifting the conversation back toward this is Muslims, like any other group of people, are a very diverse group of people. And there are all these people who are living within the US, who are assimilating, but still retaining their own culture, still retaining aspects of who they are. And Miss Marvel played a very key role. I mean, one of the things that the TV show captured shockingly well was her conversation with the Imam, where she asks him, I want to do good, and I want to be a good person. And he said, you can't really be a good person. You just have to do good. And that is something that resonated not only with audiences when they read it in the comics, but it also resonated with audiences when they saw it on TV. And Fatma is completely right as far as audience reach is concerned. Miss Marvel, as far as I'm aware, has been seen on Disney Plus over 5 million times. The maximum sales of any comic these days is maybe 1 million copies. And that's the mega hits. That is not something that is usually achieved. So usually you're getting readership somewhere in the range of 35 to 50,000. So 35 to 50,000 versus 5 million. So just the overall reach cannot be understated when it comes to adapting these type of properties for film or TV.
All right. So that brings me to my other question. We've talked about the highs of the comic book industry and like how popular Miss Marvel has become. But I have a question for you, Jahanzeb. Why do you believe that there's been such a massive decline in the comic book genre and the movie genre, not just those, but the superhero genre as a whole as well, especially after Avengers Endgame?
Part of the problem is Avengers Endgame for a very significant proportion of the audience was the end. It's right there in the title. This was the end game. So a lot of the fan favorite characters like Captain America, Iron Man, Black Widow, they were swept off the field, so they were gone. And all the new characters that came in were somewhat rushed. With Iron Man, they spent time developing him. With Captain America, you got to know who he was before you actually got to see him in the present day. Even with Black Widow, although she was just guest star in all those other movies, the character developed slowly to the point where you could be like, yes, she is a mainstay of the Avengers. After that, the problem that really arose was the audience also grew up. For a decade, children across the world essentially grew up with these superheroes. They became familiar with them, they knew who they were, They adopted them as their moral centers. But when you grow up, you realize that everything isn't as black and white. You start to recognize the gray shades that exist in society. And as you examine those gray shades, you want something that's a bit more, for lack of a better term, adult.
Is that why you think most people are shifting towards more adult content like The Boys, Invincible, and other sort of dark comic books?
I mean, The Boys is an excellent example to cite because The Boys is fantastic, but it is unabashedly adult. It does not really pull any punches. It's genuinely about just, okay, if superheroes existed in the real world, this is what they would be like. They would swear. They would absolutely not subscribe to the normal morality of society. Good and evil wouldn't really exist for them because they are all powerful. They don't have to subscribe to the morality of normal people. So that's why people are now pursuing that. And even within the Invincible, while I assume has a much smaller audience because it's animated, but it has the same thing where it's exploring how brutal the entire aspect of superheroes would be. They would fight each other. They would be completely obliterating each other. There would be blood. There would be guts. There isn't something that, with Marvel especially and DC to a large extent, you see that they can recover from pretty much any punch because they have to. That is what's baked into the concept. With Boys and with Invincible, that is no longer a concern. Because Marvel and DC have to keep the machine running. They have to keep the franchise going, so everyone must come back to point zero sooner or later. With those, you don't have to worry about that because it's an isolated property. You're getting tired of a character, kill them off. That's fine.
And then bring them back like 10 years later.
And then bring them back a little while later. And though The Boys doesn't even have to do that because they have so many characters. They can just bring in someone who's a comparison.
You think that this sudden like shift towards more darker themes is what eventually like caused, the shift towards darker comic books in the 90s, and especially with like Zack Snyder's whole Justice League as well. You think that's probably like part of the reason why a lot of people like, you think that's part of the reason why most of these big comic book companies started to be influenced to like make their franchises a lot more darker and much more edgier to appeal to like a younger audience as well?
I also think in part kind of to what you were saying, your question is like, I feel as though there's a history in comic books and superheroes that is really political. It's really, really tied into politics and a reflection of what the nation state thinks of itself. So when you think about like some of the earlier comics, like I think about like a Superman or a Captain America or things like that, they're very, very nationalistic in a way that wouldn't have resonance now because the majority of the viewpoint in at least the United States is not nationalistic in this moment. It's very, very like, frustrated at the government. And so then you start to have superheroes come out that are a bit more dark, that are a bit more edgy, that are a bit more on the inside of what it means to be human because that's kind of what the demand is, and it's what the audience needs. When you even think about a character like Miss Marvel, as you were saying, she came very wholesome. She's a wholesome character, but she came as a counterpoint to September 11th, and she came as a counterpoint to the perspective of what Muslim people were in the West, right? And so she's bubbly, she has a really good relationship with her family, she's really, really like a kid, and you kind of needed a character like that to undercut some of the political tension. Shows like The Boys and comic properties like The Boys, Generation V, even the newest iteration of Watchmen on TV, they are coming at the government in a specific way because that reflects in a lot of ways the feeling of the population towards the government. So there's a higher resonance there because it's something we're feeling. When you're frustrated at the government, when you're frustrated at these things, and you see that in a comic property, and you see that in a superhero property, and there's more kind of real estate that you can kind of sink into, that's when you're like, oh, I resonate with this, in a way that you wouldn't really resonate with like an idea of the nation post-World War II. They're very different moments in history and in time, and that I think is also why the comic book properties are changing and the film and TV properties are changing in terms of their darkness.
I mean, like Jahanzeb said, it's like a constantly running machine. There are some points where they shift their focus towards more darker themes, and some points where they just revert back to the camp. I mean, if you look at the 80s as well, with the release of like The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, those were very like politically heavy comic books, and it influenced a lot of darker stories like Death in the Family as well. And then we also saw another point where they shifted towards more darker themes in the 90s when you had a lot of darker stories like with Hal Jordan absolutely going mad and killing the entire Green Lantern Corps. And even like in the 2010s when you had Zack Snyder released Man of Steel, which was supposed to be a lot more serious and edgier Superman. But now I feel like they're returning more towards like their traditional roots with like James Gunn's new DCU as well. And I think in that sense, it proves the point about like how the comic book industry as well is influenced by a lot of these like shifts in popularity of like what people are resonating with most.
Me, it's partly also nostalgia. A lot of the kids who grew up reading comics are now the ones with the most disposable income. They're the ones who can actually spend money on this. And they want to recall the times that they were most invested in comics, which is when they were slightly more brighter, they were slightly more bubbly. And so now when they go back to them, they're like, I want to introduce my children to this, and I would like it to reflect the comic that I used to read. So the darkness that was explored in the middle, while it definitely has a place, and I'm sure it'll return in a couple of years, it has taken a back seat because the audiences are now basically saying, I want to remember what I was like as a kid when I was reading this comic, and I want to remember what I saw on the page, and I want to share that with my children or with the next generation.
And I mean, in that sense, I feel like a lot of companies like DC are starting to exploit that whole thing, like nostalgia baiting you. I mean, just look at the Flash movie. You just had like a bunch of lifeless wax figures of like Christopher Reeves, Helen Slater, and you even had Michael Keaton's Batman return for like what, just to die again, like countless times. And I think that just people are taking advantage of like the whole like nostalgia thing as well, and they're taking advantage of like veteran comic book readers' love for the characters and just trying to stuff that into movies. All right. So we've just been joined by Mudassar. Now, we already introduced you, but I'd like to ask you a question. Now, as someone currently teaching animation and graphic novels in Pakistan, what have you observed and have children sort of been inspired by superheroes and comics, or do they usually come into the genre and move on to something else entirely? And yeah.
Well, first of all, sorry for being late. I was stuck in traffic. Uh, I went from Ring Road to again Jail Road, so I got a bit late. I think कोई blockages हुई हुई हैं जहाँ पे मैं रहता हूँ, तो मैं थोड़ी उसकी वजह से late हो गया. Regarding your question, it's a very long question, so I'll try to be as close to possible with the answers. Basically, what I've seen in Pakistan is the core values and cultural values, and even the political or national values are different, and public and private values are different than America. So, when we talk about Pakistan, we talk about bullying in school, we talk about child abuse, child neglect, we talk about cousin marriages. These are the topics that mostly kids come up with. Depression, anti-psychotics, going to a psychiatrist, getting treatment for mental health problems. Suicide is another subject, though very taboo. Almost every year when I conduct a class, I have like a group of kids write a first draft of a story. Just something random. Almost more than 50% end up with the character dying or killing himself or herself or itself. And it starts from a very dark place. But later on, once the course progresses, it's a 1-year program, but we also offer a couple of other programs in which we have a 3-year program and a 2-year program. And as the child progresses from that studies, we see a very big change of him or her realizing the socio-economic problems that Pakistanis are facing day by day. So their stories are mostly about fantasy. First and foremost, they are mesmerized by Dastane Mir Hamza, Dastan-e Mir Hamza jo hai. Then there comes Imran series, Umro Yar. So हमारी जो पाकिस्तानी cultural values और हमारी जो even stories हैं, वो इस region से मुंसलिक हैं. They can't actually, they can relate to DC, Marvel, Top Cow, Image, IDW. They know Spawn. A lot of them know the characters from Spawn. And it's a very dark comic book. Secondly, they also love Deadpool. Most favorite characters are those characters that are sort of like rebels in the American comic book community. And also you have to understand, Pakistan has not gone through any kind of era, like ages. Like America went through the, I would say, the pre-silver age of comic books. Then it went through the golden age of comic books. And then you are going through currently the platinum age, or MCU is right now where you are. So it took you about almost 60, 70 years to reach where like you are right now. Pakistani comic books and Pakistani content creators have not even stepped into the doors of the first era. ठीक है? एक साल के अंदर तकरीबन हम या तो 0 comic books publish करते हैं, or either we have like 2 or 3 comic books being published. Most of the publishers that are working in Pakistan, I myself run a publishing company as well, and I have published 2-3 comic books. So we cannot actually cater to the market of our own community because one, lack of funding, lack of resources, and lack of talent. Most of our talent wants to go abroad. They say that there is no future in Pakistan, there is no scope in Pakistan, but there are some fringe groups, indie groups I would call them, that they are developing comic books in Pakistan, comic strips and web comics in Pakistan, but they are very few. Like when we talk about numbers in America, where we have thousands of publishers, then we have like the top 5 or the top 10, जिनका नाम सबको पता है. Pakistan के अंदर we have in counting 2 or 3 publishers that are actively publishing content at this moment. Or I think 2-3 publishers जो हैं उनका I can say for a guarantee they've sort of like shut down their operations and they're partially working. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. So it's a real different thing, and we have a lot of things to explore in Pakistan. Luckily, for the past 10 years, I've been teaching comic books and cartoon animation. And I've seen that during this time, I've taught about almost like rounding up the figure, it's like 4,900 something students. So I'd say it's 5,000 students that I've taught. But, thank you. But I think even with that number, what the industry needs right now, per year, we need about 10,000 developers, inkers, pencilers, comic book writers, colorists, layout artists, graphic artists, specifically for comic books. No graphic designer can say कि मैं comic books बना सकता हूँ. Because I get a lot of calls from university graduates, from masters and bachelors from NCA, Punjab University, BNU, ITU. Sir, आप मुझे जो है ना एक दफ़ा मौका दें. I send them a page or 2. ठीक है, मैं कहता हूँ, why don't you ink this comic book panel that I've penciled or I've inked? You colored it. So I wait for them for like a month. They don't call me back. Then I wait for another month. And the money has been decided. ठीक है, मसलन like per page I say कि मतलब किसी की deal होती है 1,000 रुपए per page, किसी की होती है 5,000 per page, किसी की होती है 10,000 per page. But when I call them back, so there are like people who haven't contacted me back for the past 6 years. ठीक है, and I've constantly asked them, how's the pages coming along? ठीक है, so either they switched careers because they realize, sir, this is very hard that you do, and you do it every day. So it's a very hard profession to get into, but once you're in, you're stuck. And I can see 2 or 3 of my peers sitting here. So they know the struggle of becoming an illustrator or a cartoonist or a caricaturist, because आपको एक caricature 2 मिनट के अंदर बनाना होता है. हमारी बेंचमार्क है पाकिस्तान की, जो कि मैक्सिम, फ़ीका, जावेद इकबाल, मैंने, साबिर नज़र ने और बहुत सारे और जो डिफरेंट कार्टूनिस्ट हैं, जो पॉलिटिकल सैटायर कार्टूनिस्ट हैं या कॉमिक बुक कार्टूनिस्ट हैं, उन्होंने एक सेट की है. इफ़ यू कैन नॉट मेक एन इलस्ट्रेशन विद इन 2 minutes, you should not call yourself an illustrator or a cartoonist.
All right, thank you. But that also brings up a very interesting question I'd like to direct to the entire panel. Why do you think that so many like aspiring writers or artists or like inkers, as you would put it, are discouraged from making comics specifically in Pakistan?
Well, I think the biggest problem is the financial issue. Once they graduate from an institute like mine or someone who has been a peer of mine, when we started, there were 3 institutes. One was in Islamabad, one was in Lahore, which was managed and operated by us, and then there was another one in Karachi. Karachi wala band ho chuka hai, aur Islamabad wala bhi band ho chuka hai. The person who was running the Islamabad setup is now working for Ubisoft as their head of creative in Denmark. So we always have this problem that a lot of good people who can teach get poached by big studios in America, in Denmark, in Europe, for different. And I also get like job offers every week from my emails कि यार इधर आके पढ़ाना शुरू कर दो, या इधर आके why don't you come to Australia, why don't you come to US, why don't you come to New York and start teaching in Academy Arts or Cal Arts.
Jahanzeb,
So
Fatimah,
the problem
what are your
is
thoughts?
both the students that graduate and the teachers, they get poached.
All right. Jahanzeb and Fatimah, what would your thoughts be on this? Jahanzeb and Fatimah, what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, he's completely right. The biggest barrier to creating comics anywhere is essentially just the financial aspect. It doesn't really pay much. Even in the US, unless you're one of the really big names, and
If you're working for the top 10s.
yes, and even then, the big name, you have to be a big name, and that's barely 10 to 20 people in any given year. You are not making enough to actually sustain yourself. You will need to be doing another job alongside this, and with the hours required for penciling alone, you will not have time for this. So if you don't have the finances, you're not really going to stick with it, and then you'll jump off to something that pays more, which is graphic design or illustration or even ads. And that's the same problem in Pakistan. You just don't have the money.
Fatimah, is there anything you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, I feel like I'm not a comic writer in that way, and I'm also based in the US, so I have a little bit of a different perspective. And I'm also acutely aware that this is a depressing conversation, and there's so many young people in this audience who want to be writers. And so what I will also say, just to kind of give a little bit of a different perspective, is that when you are an artist, you're an artist because you have a story to tell, and you really want to make sure that that story gets out. And that is the thing that you need to anchor to whenever you're creating, because there's so many negative voices, and there's so many things around, you can't do it, you won't be able to do this, you won't whatever. And your path is so distinct and unique, and you have no idea what is in store for you. You have no idea what will happen. And so these ideas of even being a freelance artist, like, yes, I'm a poet. You know how many people have told me that I would never make money being a poet, that I would never be able to create a career being a poet, that I would never be able to be an artist in this way? I would assume that being a poet is less readership even than being a comic writer, and gets paid less than being a comic writer. And yet that was an avenue that I needed to pursue, because it was the path that I felt was so important for my heart to take. And that's what led to so many more opportunities, and including me writing for Marvel on a TV show, you know? And yes, that's one project I did. That's not the only project I'm gonna ever do. It's not the thing that's always gonna pay my bills. It's not that. But these things are journeys that lead you to more journeys and lead you to more opportunities. And so what I would say is, allow yourself the ability to dream. Allow yourself the ability to want what you want. And you never know what you might be able to achieve, and you never know what you might be able to do. You might be someone who then is like the person who helps create or reinvigorate a certain kind of comic style or a certain kind of thing. There's so many visual artists in this world that are so incredible who make these like grand sculptures or make these kind of artworks that you never, people would have told them would have never ever gotten sold or would have whatever, and then become so successful in their way. And so I think just allowing yourself to know that you're doing it because you have a story that you want to tell, allow that to be the guiding light that leads you, and that will be the thing that illuminates your path forward.
All right, so with that well, that was a pretty inspiring message, I must say. But with that,
Also, I would like to add one thing. Even in our community, मसलन जो festivals होते हैं, जैसे there's the Urdu Adab Festival, then there's the Lahore Lit Festival. In 2012, when I started my publishing company and I started to think about launching my first comic book, I did a dry run and started to sit where you are sitting. And during the Q&A session, I would ask everyone, I've got this comic book idea and I'm developing it, and what do you guys think? Okay? So out of like 4 people in the panel, 3 would say, no, don't do it. Okay? Even in Lahore Lit Fest, I have had this conversation in numerous conferences. And from within the crowds, people have said, go ahead with it. And one person in the panels would say, he would take me or she would take me to the side. And amazingly, one of those people were Salima Hashmi. And Salima, what she does is, मेरा हमेशा कॉमिक बुक ले लेती हैं, इंडिया जाती हैं और वहाँ पे कोई बड़ी कॉन्फ्रेंस के अंदर झगड़ा करके आती हैं और वहाँ पे टेबल पे मेरी किताब छोड़ के आ जाती हैं कि हमारे मुल्क में ये लेवल ऑफ काम हो रहा है, सो शट अप. सो हमारे अपनी जो कॉन्फ्रेंसेज और हमारे जो अपने कल्चरल फेस्टिवल्स हैं उसके अंदर भी ओवर द पास्ट 10 years I've seen a drastic change that more and more content developers, comic book writers are being called in and told that yaar, you should also give us a talk. We were very not receptive to you 10 years ago, but now we are. So I think things are getting better. It should be getting better more faster. Matlab, like it should not take another 10 years for something grand to happen. But I think it should happen in a more productive and a more natural way rather than that you have like 10-year gaps and then phir kuch ho.
All right. So I think with that, we just probably have time for one last question. Now, this is directed towards the entire panel. So let's start with maybe Jahanzeb. So how do you see this art form and this genre progressing in the decades and years to come?
I mean, as much as people like to argue otherwise online, and there are a lot of naysayers, these are the modern myths. They've been around as an industry for decades. They'll be around as an industry for decades to come. There will always be comics because, as Fatimah said, there are always people who want to get their message out, who want to get their story out. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to pick up a pen, either write it out or draw it out. That is something that society has been doing since the prehistoric era. There are cave paintings that are essentially comics because they show a story being told in sequential form. That is literally what a comic is in its barest form. And they will be around forever. The only thing that could change is maybe some of the quality will go up and down. Maybe you'll have eras where it's more dark. Maybe there are eras where it's more light. But
yeah, and more digitized also.
And more digitized.
Like maybe we might go to more print-based version to more digitized version, and then come back again to print version because a lot of people say कि यार हमें वो कागज महसूस नहीं हो रहा. We can't feel the paper. So people are obsessed with the paper of the comic book.
But essentially, it's all cyclical, and sooner or later, it will come back on top. Even with movies, they may be on a decline right now, but give it another decade, you'll see them back on top.
Right, Fatimah, what do you think? Do you think that comic books will just revert back to like the original state after a few years and it's just a constant cycle?
No, I don't. I don't believe that. I think that everything is about innovation. And of course, like you bring from the past and you bring things forward. But I even think about like some of the kind of comic storylines that are being explored. A lot of my friends are comic writers and they write for Marvel, and they're being able to explore such beautiful things that. So one of my friends, Eve Ewing, is a comic writer for for Marvel. She's written for Miss Marvel, but she writes a lot for Black Panther, and she created Ironheart, the comic, which is now going to be into the TV shows. But Eve was kind of talking about a run that she had recently where she was able to explore the village life of Wakanda, and she was able to build it out in this really beautiful way because she was able to kind of create and weave a story that was more focused in Wakanda than it usually has ever been. So there's all of this story, there's all of this beauty that she was able to explore that wasn't allowed to be explored previously because so much was on the emphasis of action and all of this stuff and all of this whatever, and then because this film came out and everybody was obsessed with Wakanda, she then was allowed to kind of explore something in a very beautiful terrain. And I think about even the most recent animated Spider-Man that just came out, the animation style was incredible. It was innovative. It was so beautiful how they mixed all of this animation in this film. And that was like true artistry and innovation. When you see something like that, even when you see how they slow down the frames per second in terms of the animation, this is new technology. This is new innovation. This is new storytelling that allows for such profound storytelling to be able to happen. And so this idea of, is this on the decline? Is this not? I kid you not, how every single genre I have ever been in, they have said the death of poetry, the death of theater, the death of film. I don't believe any of it, because what I believe is it's the death of the current era, and what you're getting is so much new innovation. You're getting so much new possibility. And if you stay stuck in what was, you won't be able to adapt, and you won't be able to see what beauty is being presented to us. So I would highly encourage us to really think about this as not a death, but a closing of a door and an opening of a new one, an opening of a world that we don't even know what is possible.
Also, I think once we get Disney Plus in Pakistan, people will be more inclined towards comic books, because a lot of the content that was on Netflix and Prime that is available in Pakistan has moved to Disney Plus, and Pakistanis don't have like proper access to Disney Plus. So I think the biggest move would be if Disney Plus comes to Pakistan and we can actually subscribe and get subscriptions to that. So we will be open to a lot of content that we have not been open to for a very long time.
All right. I'm so sorry. I feel like all of us could just sit here for hours and just talking about this, but I'm afraid we just have to wrap up the session right now. I'd like to thank all our panelists for coming here and talking about this right now. All right.